Hi everyone. Thanks for having me today from Australia. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Very sad that I can't be there today. Hope everyone's having a wonderful time. So today I'm going to talk, and I'm going to try to stick to time. In fact, I'll start my timer because the first pre-recorded one I went for 31 minutes by mistake. So try and keep it brief, but I want to talk about this sort of new approach that Guillaume and I have been working on, which sort of aims to gain a more nuanced understanding of past fertility and past population dynamics. And this is very much a work in progress. So I'll be talking, I guess, sort of at a high level about the approach that we're taking in this marquesan case study. And hopefully next time I speak to you, we'll be sharing with the results of it with you. All right. So population dynamics, I think, a lot of the studies that we do in this archaeological space, we have quite a strong focus on population growth and population size, which are obviously incredibly important. But I think it's interesting to consider that population growth and population size are outcomes of these interplays between fertility, mortality, and migration. And so looking a bit more closely at those dynamics individually and collectively, and looking at how they interact with one another, is a really important way of understanding then the factors that influence each of those variables. And this really forms quite a key component of the human narrative in any part of the world, and certainly in the Pacific Islands. So these population dynamics we can sort of see as a bit of a vital sign or a vital signal for a population, because it tells us about how they're responding to extrinsic and intrinsic factors. And fertility and mortality are particularly sort of susceptible, I guess, to those fluctuations, and some very interesting things we can learn about migration as well. Biology, culture, and environment all have, and they're very, very broad groups, but we'll talk a bit more about that soon, all have the potential to interact with these population processes. And what we typically see are that population responses to these things are really complex, they're interacting, and they're often very hierarchical in nature. So with dynamic hierarchies. So in some circumstances, things from culture that might be expected to influence fertility. If we have, say, a really significant environmental event, for example, like a natural disaster, that will become the primary determining factor in how fertility is fluctuating, rather than any of the sort of cultural things that would in a normal environment influence it. So when we're doing these past reconstructions, it's not sort of as straightforward as these are the factors that influence fertility, and so this is what we might expect to see, because they're constantly, the weight of any of those factors is constantly sort of fluctuating. So when we're looking at past population dynamics, genetics, archaeology, and bioarchaeology all have sort of various proxies for looking at demographic variables. As I mentioned, a lot of these are around population growth and population size. And I guess one of the big challenges is dealing with the resolution of the methods and the sort of source data that we need to put into these approaches. So often they're very data hungry, these sort of approaches to populations. We need, a large volume of data. We often need, really quite precise data, temporally and spatially. And I guess out of that necessity, we often see these sort of regional population studies in other parts of the world. It's entire continents sometimes that we look at demographic change across a continent over thousands of years, but those sort of population patterns are very difficult to contextualize with these sort of directly influencing variables. So as I said, like biology, culture, marriage traditions can have a strong influence on fertility, and it's very difficult to associate sort of a continental shift in population with these things that fluctuate on a much smaller scale temporally and spatially more localized. And then sort of a further challenge is how we define populations, because they're very transient. So, a lot of the time, I think, in paleodemography, and I do this myself, is we talk about population. Really what we just mean is the people that populated the space and time that we're looking at. But that definition of population doesn't really marry up with, colloquial definitions of population. It can be difficult to communicate that information about population, and we have to think about how meaningful a population is if we don't acknowledge the transient nature of it. So just another sort of challenge. So Guillaume and I started working together on this project. I had done some work to come up with a sort of approach to studying past population dynamics that's a bit more nuanced and a bit more considered, I suppose, in terms of how these extrinsic and intrinsic factors influence a variable such as fertility or mortality, and therefore the contribution that makes to population growth. And the idea is to use what we've termed a ground-up approach, which instead of sort of going, this is the methodology, it's quite data hungry, and so we're going to have to pull data from a large region or a large period of time. Instead, we wanted to flip that and say, well, what can we learn on a more localized level about, a community or a population, as much as we can delineate that? And can we study it in such a way that we can see whether the approach we're taking is at an appropriate scale as we do it? So essentially, are we treating a group that's heterogeneous as homogeneous when we come from the top down? From the ground up, we're hoping that we can see at what point a population sort of ceases to be homogeneous to some degree, and at what scale, either temporally over thousands of years or spatially over what region, do populations become sort of heterogeneous in how they're responding to things. And the idea is that this approach will guide high resolution case studies of population responses, and that information can be fed into a model, which then allows us to sort of investigate things in the absence of data. So if we know that in certain circumstances, precipitation has a certain interaction with fertility, then if we have an absence of data for precipitation, we can sort of estimate it in the absence of it. And the way that we're going about this is something called path analysis. It's quite common in demographic and biological anthropology research and in the study of modern populations. But it's a really useful tool. It's a bit of like mind mapping, I suppose. It's sort of a really useful tool for thinking very logically about how we expect. So say at one end we've got fertility, and I'll show a diagram of this in a moment. One end we might have fertility, and at the other end, the classic thing that comes up in paleodemography is the transition to agriculture in much of the world. So we go, we've got transition to agriculture, we've got higher fertility, but how do we actually get there? And it forces that sort of thinking of what are the pathways? Is there just one pathway, or are there multiple pathways? It doesn't necessarily have to be as linear, that relationship. It can be complex. So this path analysis really accommodates these sorts of things quite well. So what Guillaume and I are currently in the process of doing is applying this sort of method to the Marquesan Islands, over the histories pre-European contact of about 800 years. This is a really nice case study to take this approach with, because we do have some expectations, I suppose, or hypotheses already about what we might be expecting to see. So we're expecting that we might have small groups, colonizing groups that potentially have quite a high proportion of reproductive aged individuals, which then allows for quite fast growth of the population and high fertility. There's also a noted period of expansion and subsequent population growth in this period, 1300 to 1600 AD. So it gives us something, again, to sort of look for in this. Now, this is the diagram that I mentioned. I'm going to have to this always happens. I always get to this point and then I have to condense the remaining part of the talk. So fertility over here, which we estimate through various proxies. In my case, I do a lot of proxy estimates using bioarchaeological sources, but there are other options for this. These factors in the middle here are typically unobservable. These are usually latent variables that we just don't have any sort of proxy for, we don't have any information for. But they are important in this pathway in getting to fertility. So coming to this sort of first or last column, depending on how you look at it, something like energetic resources, it doesn't directly influence fertility. What it does is it influences age at menarche, reproductive function, and potentially as well some sociocultural factors too. So it has this path that it travels through to influence fertility. And mapping this out is really, really great in terms of thinking about what goes through which pathways, and as you can see, a lot of factors, usually influence a single pathway. And then we can go through and say, okay, well, these things that we know influence fertility through a certain pathway, what can we look at in the archaeological record or the historical record, or even linguistics, various sort of transdisciplinary approaches to obtaining some idea of what these things look like. And so, an example, energetic stress is known to affect ovarian function, and therefore reproductive capacity and fertility. So we can look at energetic stress as what sort of subsistence strategies people were involved in, what sort of activities they were involved in, and also skeletal markers of stress. We can gain some idea of what this looks like, and then we can start to look at this pathway of how it influences fertility. So just really quickly, I'm going to run through some of these things. I will unfortunately skim over it because I'll try to stick to time, but it would be great to talk further about this at the end. So, variation in precipitation, localized ecologies, are very much true of the Marquesas Islands, and these are things that we would expect to have an influence on fertility. Some of those sort of more broad things like ensocycles as well precipitation has a very interesting relationship with fertility, which I'm happy to talk about later. But sort of fluctuations in precipitation depending on where you're located, what time of year it is, what's happening with these cycles. And then, of course, these can all culminate in bigger events such as flooding and mudslide, which we may be interested in terms of natural disasters, likewise with tsunamis. These all have quite a strong influence on fertility. Subsistence as well. Thank you. Subsistence as well, we have, diverse resources. Typically, sort of whether you have a marine or terrestrial diet will not have a strong influence. But what we're really interested in is this labour intensiveness of these activities. So if they're very labour intensive, it will have a significant effect on ovarian function. And severe droughts also have a suppressive effect. Health and disease is a really fascinating area. There's obviously some osteological evidence into health in the Marquesas Islands, but there's also these sort of linguistic approaches that look at the antiquity of certain diseases and treatments. So quite a very transdisciplinary way of looking at this. And then sociocultural factors, things like conflict and warfare, as well as, sexual behaviours, marriage traditions. It's sort of this piecing together of all the information that we can from archaeology, ethnography, some of these historical sources as well, and understanding how these things interact. The proxies for population size and growth in this region, Guillaume has done some work in these domestic units and sleeping houses and the expected number of individuals that correspond to sort of the size and layout of those. There's also these estimates from skeletal remains that we've done some preliminary work on, which seems to sort of align quite well with expectations. But of course, all this needs to be very cautiously treated. I think, like in any case, these sort of transdisciplinary approaches, the more proxies and more information we have, the better. And we can sort of cross-validate across those. So at the moment, we're working through adapting this path diagram to the case study. We're envisaging that it'll produce sort of deeper and more nuanced understandings of specific population dynamics and the factors that interact with them. We still have this challenge of, gaining data that have the right specificity, but we're sort of working through that and trying to make this approach suitable to the data that we have available. And it's a really nice technique. We don't have time to go over it, but it does lead into a sort of statistical analysis, which allows us to do things like model comparison and sort of evaluating these complex relationships. Thank you very much.